Hi there, I'm Evan Troxel. Welcome to my podcast about how technology is changing the architectural profession. Welcome to the Troxel Podcast. My name is Evan Troxel. In this episode, the conversation is with Andrew Heumann. Andrew's probably most well known for his Grasshopper plugins, including Heumann, Heumann UI, and MetaHopper, which we do discuss a little bit in this show. He's also really well known just for his contribution and his presence within the computational design side of AEC. In this episode, we talk a lot about tool building. And really the thesis of this episode was about building tools that people love to use versus the tools that people hate to use. I think we all have different versions of those two categories, but it is probably pretty well known that Andrew's tools are some of the more beloved tools in the computational design field. And now he's working at Hypar. And if you had the chance to listen to one of the earlier episodes with Ian Keogh, who's one of the founders, you have a better idea of the types of things that Andrew is helping to build in that small team. So we talk a little bit about tools, we talk a little bit about culture, we talk a little bit about design. We also talk about Andrew's generative artwork and some of the things that he's doing outside of his day job to stay sane. So if you don't know Andrew and you want to learn more about him after hearing this episode, I really encourage you to check out the links that are in the show notes for this episode. And I hope you enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with Andrew Heumann. Andrew Heumann, welcome to the show. It's great to have you. Great to see you again.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
So you are currently working in New York with Hypar.
Yep.
And I mean, Hypar is a distributed workforce. We had Ian on the show.
Yeah.
He was one of the early episodes. He's here in Southern California. And so you guys are all over the place. You're a small team though, right? But you're very distributed. You've got whereas Anthony's like in Massachusetts, I think. Is that right?
Yep, and Matt is as well, and yeah.
Yeah. All right. So you guys. It's funny because there's all of this stuff going on with like physical office buildings. I don't know if you saw this. REI is sent out this note that they're selling their new headquarters and they're going to distributed headquarters. Yeah. And you guys never had that problem.
Yeah, well, we didn't. It's funny, actually. I worked on that project at least a little bit during my time at NBBJ. It's an NBBJ project, and I worked on some computational tools around the district where that project is sited in Bellevue and a little bit on the project itself. And yeah, it's just crazy. I feel like this moment is obviously causing everybody to rethink their relationship to the physical workplace. And, in a way, it's funny because it's not something that has affected us directly much at Hypar because we've just been a distributed workplace from the beginning.
Right.
We've never had a physical office. We've never gotten used to work patterns that require us to, lean over to each other or whatever. We kind of make all of that work digitally. So it hasn't been a huge change for me personally.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. And you guys utilize Discord for a lot of your communication and back and forth. Do you know, I'm sure Ian probably and Anthony decided to go that direction, but I'm sure you weighed in on that. Like, how'd that come about? Why Discord instead of, Teams or Slack or something else that most tech companies are using?
Yeah, well, interestingly, we do use Slack internally. So our team, when we're just talking among Hypar employees, we use Slack. We opted for Discord probably for a kind of boring reason, which is just that like it was easier to do more without paying. So, I think we have a free Discord server and it's easy to, bring on as many members and things like that as we want. It holds on to history. It just felt like it was a little bit easier to make it open to a broader community. And so it's been a little fun. We talked about maybe moving our internal communications to Discord too. Right now we kind of juggle both, but I've really liked seeing that community blossom on Discord and have people, kind of weighing in, not just about our product and the things that we're building, but about the state of the industry and its relationship to technology in general.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting threads or channels in that Discord is the future of the profession. One where people really are discussing some pretty deep stuff, and it's hard to do that especially in a non-threaded environment. Like, it's just a channel and stuff gets dumped into there. That to me is the biggest downfall of Discord at this time, is that it's not threaded. So you kind of lose track of who's talking to who because it's just linear.
Well, it's funny because Slack was not threaded when it first came out either. And I remember people were really angry when Slack added threads. And now I can't imagine life without them. It's so much easier to keep literal threads sort of organized.
And I think, and that probably is an outcome of people living on these tools a lot more, right? Where it's like, oh, you're just on it all the time. And so threads really do help you kind of manage the information a little bit better, for sure. So that's interesting that you guys have two different tools for this. So you kind of have to keep things in separate buckets. But I do really think it's amazing that you've pulled together a community that's way bigger than the product itself. Like, as far as the concepts, the ideas that are shared, and the tools that people are talking about, and how it's great for you guys is like it's a looking glass into the thoughts of the industry, and it's all right there, right at your fingertips. Totally. That's super cool. And it's only that you guys can do that because of who you are, and I think that your history and what you've been able to kind of build these communities over time.
Totally. I mean, we have all benefited from these kinds of communities. I like to say I grew up on the Grasshopper forum. I basically learned to code by participating in the Grasshopper forum. A lot of my friends and important business relationships, in some way or another, overlapped right there on the internet. And, I think the Dynamo forum was sort of is still similarly dynamic. Mm-hmm. And we just, we understand that Hypar as a product will live or die on the sort of the quality and depth and breadth of our community. It is, we're trying to do something that impacts the industry as a whole, and it's impossible to do that unless we're really tied into what's going on in the industry, and we have people out in the world who, are doing the work day to day, who can give us real close feedback about what does and what doesn't work, and about what they're thinking about, and about what their challenges are. It's really easy the further you move from, kind of day-to-day practice. I started as, doing design technology at NBBJ, and I've kind of steadily stepped further and further from the sort of day-to-day practice of design. It's really important to maintain that connection so we don't lose touch with what would be relevant, what would be useful, what do real projects look like, what do real problems look like.
So I'm now thinking with software development and releases. So you've come from a long history of, you've had Human UI, you've had these different plugins for Grasshopper, and you'd put them up on Food for Rhino, right? And you would write up some release notes. And now you don't do that anymore, right? Like, now you put an announcement into Discord that says, hey, there's this new thing. I put together this GIF, I put together this video, and I'm going to put an announcement on Twitter. But because all of the development, it's all happening and running in real time, basically, like you're iterating so fast, and new releases come out all the time. Like, it's just whatever the latest thing you're working on is. And how do you get the word out? How do people know to look for these new features? It's completely different story than where you've come from previously.
Totally. And I think it's a completely different story from the way people have come to expect to interact with the software that they use for their work.
Yeah.
We're not doing a yearly release where we have, this laundry list of new features.
Right.
It's like, even when we're not making announcements, we're doing releases like every week that are fixing bugs, that are releasing new things. Sometimes we get so wrapped up in actually doing the work of improving the platform that we haven't been as good about remembering to tell people about all of the improvements and the features and things that we've added. We're trying to be much better about that. But it is really a totally different way to work, where you're just constantly building a thing and putting it out there in the world, rather than waiting for it to be, some perfectly polished gem that has the exact right feature set. And there are advantages and disadvantages to working that way.
Well, in a lot of ways, it's a lot like an architectural project, right? Where it's just it's a constant work in progress. Everybody on the team is very tied into the daily updates that are happening, that are throughout the days, throughout the weeks. And it's just this train is on the tracks and it's going down and it's moving, right? Versus, like you're talking about, the yearly release cycle is very much not like those are, you're talking about Revit and you're talking about Hypar, Revit 2021, like there's never going to be a Hypar 2020 and a Hypar 2021. It's just Hypar, right? Yeah, that's interesting because exactly. It seems to me like this was really ushered in because of, I'm looking at my phone right here, where the auto app updates, they come in, and it's like, how important are release notes now anymore? Like, does anybody go into the app store to read the release notes? No, nobody does, because it's just the latest version of the app, and they could completely change everything about it. That doesn't happen very often, but they could, and it's just going to show up on your phone one day.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it requires a degree of care with those changes, because you don't want to break something that someone has been relying on. You don't want to counteract some intuition that someone has already built up about how your product works and thinks. So, it means we do have to think a little bit before every change we make, instead of saying, okay, we're going to prototype this thing and then, we're going to make it the way that users want to think about it. We just have to constantly have that in mind.
Okay. So the idea for this podcast was really about designing tools that people love to use, because you, I think, are kind of at the center of that. Like there are tons and tons and tons of Grasshopper plugins out there, and most of them fly under the radar, and most of them are really bespoke, and they do a certain little thing. But you had a completely different approach. You basically exposed Grasshopper to a much wider audience because you developed a tool that made it so that not everybody had to get into the spaghetti, right? So human UI, and for those people who are out there who don't know what it is, basically you've developed. Why don't you explain what the tools are that you've developed, and then we can start to talk about why people like to use them.
Yeah. So, I think Human UI is probably the best known, which is essentially a way to use Grasshopper to construct proper user interfaces that basically make your Grasshopper script look and behave like an app. You can really customize the appearance and hide away a lot of the visual programming spaghetti in order to make these definitions accessible to more people. The other two plugins that are fairly popular, Human was actually the first one I released, which is just about tightening the relationship between Grasshopper and Rhino, expanding the kinds of objects in Rhino you can look at, like hatches and blocks and things in the Rhino environment, like layers and materials and things that Grasshopper normally can't operate on. And then the other one is MetaHopper, which is sort of a pro tool for folks who actually want to use Grasshopper to manipulate Grasshopper itself, to do kind of like programming where you'll build a Grasshopper script that's designed to like operate on your Grasshopper script rather than operate on something else, operate on a model or on the Rhino environment.
I love the name, MetaHopper. It's awesome. Because it's interesting. So you've got these three different kind of sets of tools, right? Because every install of these is like a ton of components for Grasshopper.
Right.
But okay, so now talk about why. So that, again, the concept of this was tools that people love to use versus hate to use, right? And so there's lots and lots of. Right. I think there's just a lot floating around that idea, and I thought you would be great to talk about that, because it seems to me like this is one of those, especially Human UI, because it is an abstraction layer on top of Grasshopper that allows more people to get into the tools and use them effectively. Like, what's been your experience with developing a tool like that, and the feedback that you've gotten?
Yeah, I think it's always one of the things that Grasshopper has sort of opened my eyes to, and this is sort of a mental image that I've formed over time, is just this sort of endlessly towering stack of layers of abstraction on top of each other. At the very bottom, you have the zeros and ones and the machine language and all of this other stuff. And then, you've got low-level languages, and then you've got high-level languages. And then on top of that, you've got platforms, and then you've got scripting languages like Grasshopper on top of the platforms. And then you've got, coding inside the scripting platforms, and so on and so forth. And I just think that this is fundamentally the nature of these digital tools, is that they allow you to operate at all of these different levels of abstraction. And Human UI was designed to, I think, expose the logic of a Grasshopper script as an application, as an interface that someone else could use. It's actually a way of hiding, some of the core functionality, because it grew out of an experience that I had working at NBBJ, which was that I was leading a team doing a lot of, design computation work internally, and we would build all these amazing scripts. And somehow, every time, they would sort of fail to penetrate the practice. They would fail to become useful to people. And I think a lot of that had to do with just pure fear.
Yeah, I was going to say intimidation.
Trepidation.
Yeah.
Yeah, about Grasshopper itself, feeling like this isn't my territory. This isn't for me. I'll leave this to the geeks over in that corner. And, but that fundamentally misses one of the core things about Grasshopper that makes it so powerful, which is this idea of being able to build something once and reuse it over and over again. It's no good if only you can reuse it. And so Human UI was one of the first things that, I think really was, in my mind, making that more true, making the possibility of reuse more available. I actually think sort of HyperArt continues on that trajectory even further. We can talk about that maybe a little bit more later. But I think with Human UI, there's a lot of comfort that comes from sort of known interface paradigms. I think that the interface is itself a language. And I think the thing about Grasshopper is it's an interface that's very much a foreign language to people. They'll look at it and can't make heads or tail of it. It doesn't look like anything they've ever used before. And so they're scared of it. And over time, in an organic way, a sort of vocabulary of interface paradigms has grown that we've all grown used to. And I mean, even just desktop software today looks fairly different from the way it looked 10, 20 years ago. And people working then would probably be super intimidated by the graphical user interfaces and the touch interfaces that we use. So I think that, the intent of Human UI was to allow you to take the logic of something like Grasshopper, but wrap it in this language, in this other language, translate it to a language that other people can speak, and actually create a way that someone could relate to it and not be scared off by it, and actually do something useful with it by understanding what it was meant to do. An interface is always, in the same way that an architecture might speak to what's happening inside through its articulation. I think an interface is a way of describing what a piece of software is capable of.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about it in that way, because I have two kind of images floating in my mind. One is this is software, right? This is almost all software that people interact with is through a UI, and it's not at the building block level of that. And so you are having this kind of veil of UI, which the cool thing about yours is your idea is that it's flexible. You can do whatever you want with it. It's that layer sitting on top of all this other stuff, and you get to design what that looks like too. And so there's kind of another layer of design going on. You're designing a script, you're designing a building, and you're designing a UI to interact with the script that drives the building, right? So there's layers of design problems going on there. And then I'm also thinking of the way cars have gone, where if you bought a new Volvo or a new Mercedes or something and you pop the hood, you see a giant piece of plastic. That's it. You have this nothing. You don't have access to, you can't even change the oil on your car anymore, right? Because now they're just relying on the sensors, and they don't want you in there tinkering with it. And so they've kind of removed that ability, and the UI is now on the dashboard, and they're just saying, no, just wait for the light to come on, right? just wait for us to tell you. And so to me, it's interesting, because the whole appeal of using Grasshopper is to get under the hood and tinker with the things. But that's not for everybody. Clearly, it's not. And so you've built a way to still harness the power of the tinkering and the ability to build custom tools for your company, and hopefully they do get reused over time, but you've actually created a way for that to happen and for more people to touch it.
Yeah. And I think, if you look at it in that light, Grasshopper did the same thing in its own way. It's a layer of visual abstraction over the top of a lower level construct, which is, writing code, connecting processes together, scripting and stuff. But it makes that friendlier and made it accessible to a generation of designers. And I think that every time there's always a trade-off though between the sort of friendliness of the interface and the level of control that you have as a user of that interface. You always, and so the thing that I like about Grasshopper is that like once you reach a certain point, you drill down and you need to go one level deeper and you need to dig into the Grasshopper script. The same is true for Human UI. Maybe you reach the limits of what somebody's sliders allow you to do, and now you have to dive into the Grasshopper script in order to take that control. So I think I'm really in favor of tools that permit that kind of level jumping, where you can rely on the high level stuff insofar as it does everything you need it to do, but it doesn't block you from going one level deeper when you need to do something more sophisticated or custom.
It's unlike the phone app, because on that, if the slider doesn't go as far as I need it to go, like, what am I going to do? But on this one, you've actually enabled people to be able to first of all, just understand that they can get in there and tinker with it. I think you've created kind of a door to Grasshopper that didn't even exist before, because before, like you were saying, some people are like, that is not for me. But now maybe there is at least the ability for them to like peek through the door and say, no, I could change that one little part to make it do what I want.
Right, exactly. And I don't know to what extent in practice people actually do that. Like, I don't know if people are brave enough to peek behind the curtain of the UI and get into the Grasshopper script, but I have to imagine it happens sometimes.
Well, I know it does. I know it does in our firm. And I think that one of the things, I guess this starts to bring me to building tools that people love to use, is so if you were to put a survey out with, 10 different tools on it, I'm guessing that yours and probably Nate's, or, there's going to be a few that are totally at the top of that list where people actually smile when you talk about them. So was that a conscious decision on your part, or did you just have some kind of like, you just knew that it was going to be like that, or was that just totally take you by surprise?
I mean, it was certainly not like a planned thing in that I was like, oh, I'm going to set out to build a tool that people will relate to in this particular way. I was mostly building it for myself. And I think that actually a lot of really beloved tools do start from that kernel of like, I have a problem. Like, I can't get people to use my script. So the way that actually a lot of it started, we were hard coding like custom plugins for every script we wanted to distribute, and we would compose the interface that way. And it was like, this isn't sustainable. We can't actually like custom develop a UI for every single script we want to develop. So let's do it in the tool that we're already using. So, I think that it's a really deep and meaningful question. Like, what is it that makes people love a tool? And I do think that it's like when it operates right at that threshold of something that I was too scared to tackle or was impractical to tackle before, and it's like opening all of these doors. I think of Grasshopper that way for me. That's a tool that I will love for the rest of my life. Yeah. I feel like very emotionally compelled by Grasshopper as a tool because it took something that I was like maybe a little shaky on and then wrapped it with just enough of an abstraction that I could start to do all these things with it.
Well, you built a career on it.
It resonated with the way that I was thinking about the problems. Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you about this today if Grasshopper if I hadn't been exposed to it in my schooling. So
it changed my life, man. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I mean, totally. You can find there's a pretty like sappy post I made on the Rhino forum talking about just like how much I love McNeil and Rhino and Grasshopper.
I remember when you posted that because it was like, as forums can be, they can be a fairly toxic place sometime where it's just a load of complaints, right? And it's like, how come it doesn't do this? And how come you're not on my timeline? And you had like really good timing on that. I really felt like when you put that out there, and then just the outpouring that came out from that spark that you put out there was so fun. And like you said, like this is a meaningful tool. You have built your career up till this point on that, and with these tools, and you've built communities, and you've built an additional love. You've probably opened the door for so many other users of that tool. So to see kind of the piling on that happened from that post. It was
Yeah.
really just like a breath of fresh air. And so that was really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I really look to McNeil as role models in this. Like, I want to make tools that people love as much as people love Rhino.
Yeah. My only story of meeting Bob, it was at, I think it was at, I want to say SIGGRAPH, and two guys at a booth showing Rhino, and they had like the zebra pattern on the car fender, and they're showing like I'm an architect, right? So I was there and I was looking at Form Z and Electric Image, and like Revit may or may not have been there at that time, like not even an Autodesk thing, right? But it was very early days, and they're like, hey, like all booth people do, they're trying to get you to come over and take a look at it. And hey, what do you think
Yeah.
about this? And they're showing these NURB surfaces with the continuity and all this stuff. And I was just like, yeah, I build like buildings. I build walls. They're straight up and down. And it was cool to see, because I ended up going into more of like the visual effects side of things, and where people do
Yeah.
use lots of curved surfaces and stuff. But at that time, it was like, that's cool, but it's not for me. And now just to see how far it's come, but how they've also kept the company like
Yeah.
intentionally, I don't want to say small, but independent, right? Like it's
Yeah.
it's been really a joy to watch that happen in an industry where things get gobbled up and they die every single day.
Yeah. And I don't think it's a mistake that, like, there's a relationship between a sort of conscious set of business practices, like, we want to run this company in a way that is correct, and the product itself also being sort of like beloved. Like, I think that there's, I don't know that it's, maybe there are examples of horrible companies making products that we love, but I feel like there's something natural about this relationship where, if you build your business and your employees in their relationships and the way that they relate to a community in a conscious way, then the product benefits from that too, and will have that same kind of love from its community.
So how does that kind of thinking that you've witnessed there, and with the tools that you've built, how does that translate now to Hypar? It's because you guys are starting on a journey. Like, there's no end in sight. Like we just already talked about, the development
Yeah.
cycle is just continuous, and there's so much to do, and you have to be so intentional about a lot of that stuff. But on the flip side of the coin, I guess you have to be able to say no. We have to go in this direction. We've got to build something really big. We've got to be able to scale it. How does that fit into like your guys' day to day, and how does that translate into a new tool and a new platform?
Yeah, I mean, that's like a huge question. I mean, I think we're really all united by this vision of what's possible. And we all have slightly different versions of that vision, but there's enough in common there that we really feel like Hyper can become the thing that we all see, which is, a totally modern way to think about doing design work. I think that for me, one of the kernels of that is that, like, actually design work is a lot like software development, and it should, you shouldn't have to start from scratch. You should be able to pull in existing libraries. It should be easy to reuse components and build on existing levels of abstraction. Like, it's all the same thing. And design really does work that way already. It's just the tools don't reflect it.
Right.
So there are lots of other aspects of that. But I think, like, we're all really excited by the vision of what's possible. And I think we've found that when we talk about that with other people, they start to see it too. One of the most rewarding things for us has been when we have conversations with folks about what we're trying to build, and then later on we see them on Twitter or in meetings or whatever, talking about it and sort of selling the vision
Yeah.
independent of us, and
Right.
actually, articulating it in a way that makes sense to them. So, I think obviously our relationship with the community is a huge part of that. We all have, connections with the Grasshopper community and the Dynamo community and the Revit developer community and all of this stuff. And it's really important to us to maintain those connections, even just, sort of socially or in an informal way, just so that we stay attuned to what's actually happening in the industry and what people really need. As far as like an internal organization, I think that, I give Ian and Anthony a ton of credit for really also setting out to build a company that's not just going to take all of the VC money that could possibly be thrown our way and grow, grow, grow. I obviously know what a grow, grow, grow company is like, having been at WeWork for a few years, and it has a lot of challenges. The other thing that I think has really contributed is that Matt, who's our CTO, who I report to, has really made a pretty phenomenal conscious effort to build a kind of healthy and respectful internal culture. And we're a tiny team, so it's easy to not think about that and just rely on the fact that our personalities kind of gel.
Yeah.
But we've been really, really mindful of trying to build up a team, and this is largely Matt, I think, that really has processes in place to ensure that feedback comes in the right form, and it's not aggressive, and it's not it happens in the right way. It can be informal, but it can still be constructive, and that everybody feels like they can contribute to the product. I think this is probably just a universal experience in any professional context, but imposter syndrome is like a real thing. I've faced it at every job I've ever worked at.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that Matt had me do when I first joined Hypar was the first thing I had to do was like release a feature to production. It was like, okay, here's what you're going to do. We're going to design a feature, and you're going to build the whole thing, and it's going to pass through all these systems. And I was like, I don't know if I can do that. Like, that's so much stuff is like beyond my reach. And he was like, no, you will do that. And that's how this is going to work. And just having that experience right off the bat and being able to like fail sometimes, but then, figure out how to correct it and get reviewed on the work that I was doing in a way that was constructive, and then just feel like I actually had delivered something. Like, I released a feature, here it is. Nothing, I think, in my professional career has ever been more effective at kind of dispelling that sense of imposter syndrome. It's like, look, we're all here, we're all working, we're all building stuff, and it's really unlike anything I've ever experienced. I feel really grateful to work in an environment that operates that way.
It makes me think of how when somebody gets hired at a company and they're continually trying to impress and that imposter syndrome is a part of this. And at some point in my career, somebody said, "You've already got the job, right? Like you've been hired.
Yeah.
Stop. This is no longer an interview. That thing is over. It's time to move on. And now we are all in this for better. Like this is going to be our relationship, the beginning of it, and we're going to build it." And I think like that's a great testament to that kind of mindset about building a culture by we're in this together. And you're not just feeling like you're on the spot and you have to perform all the time. It's like, no, we're going to get work done, and work is messy, right? And so as architects, I think we're okay with that more than a lot of other companies are, or professional types. But we have to continually kind of go back and remind ourselves that we're okay with that, because there's so many other influences that's not okay. It has to be perfect every time, and you have to execute.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, and I mean, one more piece of that I think is embedded in our culture is this idea of, kind of like blame-free postmortems. Like, whenever something goes wrong, and believe me, I have broken stuff so many times since I joined the company. I've like released a feature to production that would crash stuff, and all kinds of stuff has gone wrong. But the culture that just says like, the thing that matters is like solving the problem and then figuring out how to not commit the same mistakes next time. The nowhere in that process is it about blame or about saying, you screwed up, like you need to be punished. Like it just isn't about that at all. And it's really refreshing.
Yeah. I mean, you can tell just by talking to you guys. I mean, I think it was at AU last year, so almost a year ago, when you guys had a booth, and I don't think you were there at that point, right? But it was Anthony and Matt and Ian were all there. And you can, like, it's just like one person hands off a conversation to another, and it just picks right back up. And it's very, like you guys are very complimentary to each other. And so I think when things really start to overlap a lot more is when those types of conversations that you're having or that you're talking about that don't happen, because it's like, you're invading on my turf And so now we have to compete, right? And that to me is, I mean, that's a great reason to stay intentionally, with a smaller team where you've got expertise in different areas that complement each other, and you can work through and come at problems with a very different experience sets to broaden kind of how everybody thinks about that stuff. I think that's also an important factor that also is lended from architecture in general. I think, again, going back to projects and the work that we do, it definitely benefits from wider experience sets and from different sets of expertise and lots of input.
Yeah, there's this I'm going to bastardize the wording, but there's this sort of commonplace in software development that the architecture of a piece of software will inevitably come to reflect the shape of the organization that creates it. And I think that that's also true in a way of design projects. You start to the sort of the way that the pieces all fit together is very much a reflection of the way that the people who create the thing relate to each other, and how, if they're highly regimented and structured in their individual responsibilities, then it might not sort of flow as well. And I think it's certainly true with the software stuff. And I think, our engineering team really makes an effort too, that it's we don't have a front end person and a back end person and and an ML person. We just kind of all dive into all of the pieces. And I think it makes for a more cohesive and a more nimble process.
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't heard of that before, but it seems to make sense, right? It's because the thing that you're making is an expression of the makeup of the team. And so you're going to get some people who are more dominant than others in that process, and that expression is going to be more skewed towards them. And that doesn't always come out as aesthetic. It could be function. It could be a lot of different things, but it very much is an expression of the creators, right? So I think you see that a lot in architects. I mean, right? Because you're thinking about what their buildings look like. I mean, that's how we all kind of come upon buildings. And it's well, if they're all kind of very similar, that is definitely an expression of that individual or that team or whatever, that firm.
Yeah, absolutely.
So with the experience that you've brought with human tools to the Hypar team, I mean, have you guys had discussions about building tools that people love to use and kind of getting that, I don't want to call it a cult following, but it's starting to verge there with the tools that you've built over the years. So what are the kinds of things that you guys take into consideration when you're building tools and thinking about how people actually use them and how they want to use them versus not want to use them?
It's something that we talk about, either directly or indirectly quite a lot. It's, it is really important to us to build tools that people really enjoy. And I think it's especially important when we're talking about creative tools, because, I don't know, maybe some people feel this way about Excel. Some people probably do. But I feel like when it comes to a tool that there's a certain flow state that you enter into when you're doing creative work, when you're designing something that wants to have no friction, but also not much friction. It's sort of this sweet spot where you get just enough resistance from the tool that'll guide you towards good things, whether that's tools like Figma for UI design that are going to, tend you towards the certain sorts of operations, or pixel widths or whatever that are going to work well for an application or a website, or the ways that, Photoshop or Illustrator sort of manifest the characteristics of the medium, whether it's, bitmaps or vector graphics or whatever else. And I think that we want to make a tool that is sort of well suited to the kinds of tasks that people want to do in them, and in a way that enables them basically through automation, by automatically solving certain problems and being magical where it can be, but also not providing a barrier to doing things a different way, or to overriding those things, or to pop down a level of abstraction to deal with something in more detail. So one of the things we're working on right now is, and this is something that I've been talking about even since before I joined Hypar, is the importance of the coexistence of manual or direct intervention, direct manipulation, and automated solutions. So one of the things that's tricky about a tool like Grasshopper is that you sort of build this crazy script and it has all these controls and it makes this super intelligent parametric entity. But then the minute you want to go move this one piece over here, you can't. You have to like bake it and remove all of the parametric associativity and intelligence. And then you're just dealing with like a bunch of dumb geometry again. And so one of the things we're trying to do is figure out how to let those things coexist in a healthy and productive way, because a designer just wants to design. They don't want to necessarily think that, first they're going to think about it in terms of the broad high level strokes of, maybe a general massing, maybe a few parameters, what's the overall height, how high are the levels, those kinds of things. But then they're going to want to make individual tweaks, and they're going to want to make decisions that counteract the things that were decided for them automatically as a sort of default. So to me, I think a key for creative tooling is this ability to let the kind of magic coexist with the very direct and the very manual. And I don't think we've cracked that quite yet, but it's definitely something we're working actively on.
That is a delicate balance, because one of the terms I've used to explain why you would want to have these parametric entities, as you called it, right? Like is that it allows the designer to play. And talking about creative software, a lot of times these tools that you guys are building are talked about as if, well, we're going to remove all of these barriers of reuse. We're going to create more efficiency. It's going to be more productive because you're not having to start from a blank page. But at the same time, you also want to create tools that allow people to play with design and get informed feedback.
Yeah, right. And I think the thing that's tricky is that play happens at many different scales.
Yes.
And in design, it happens at many scales simultaneously. And so, when you can play with Legos, you can play with clay, you can play with like a 3D print that you made, but like every single one of those things is going to have a certain degree of sort of constraint to it, of limitation, which can be productive. If you're building it up from Legos, it's probably a lot more expensive to get to the high tower than it is if you were just going to sketch it. If you sketch it, you can do that quickly. You can iterate on the overall form 5 or 6 times. To do that with Legos, you'd have to sort of plan in advance.
Right.
With clay, you can like shift it around a little bit. And so I think it's all about striking the right balance and the right kinds of interaction and control and play at the right moments. And I tend to think that like architectural design is especially challenging for this because it's big concrete problems nested inside of fuzzy problems, nested inside of concrete things, nested inside of like fuzzy and loose associations. And it just like, it's very hard to imagine being able to like write a script that generates a whole thing, but you also don't want to rely on just having to model every single entity from scratch. And we don't do that even today. Things like Revit are already introducing magic to turn your model into 2D drawings and to do the right things with components and things like that.
It's interesting for me to think about it at the macro scale, because at the micro scale, and you have a lot of experience with this working at NBBJ and the various other companies you've worked with, where you've been put onto a particular set of problems that is not maybe the scale of the whole building. So maybe it's the horizontal landscape in the district, or maybe it's a wall in the lobby, or maybe it's, typically these tools are employed upon discrete areas and not the entire thing. But Hypar is a different animal, right? You guys are now starting to build a tool that is taking on all of the levels of scale that you just talked about, potentially, and keeping it parametric, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the hope. And I think the only way we get to a future where many different scales and many different components of the built environment can all be sort of operated on through an automatic way is to enable just that part first. Like, we'll only get there by building up from successive parts. So right now on Hypar, there are tools that will do a site level master plan. And there are tools that will turn your walls into like individual detailed wall panels with every single member. And that doesn't necessarily mean, you can, but really, in terms of the full realization of a project, you can't necessarily connect the dots between those two scales. But I think our hope is that if we can facilitate sort of manual work as it currently happening in between those scales, if you can just easily go back from, a manual process to an automated one, back to a manual one, and not lose a lot of work or a lot of power or a lot of control, then ultimately we'll be able to build up enough of a library of functionality, logic, intelligence, algorithms, components, things like that, that people actually genuinely can rely on for reuse and for automation. But that'll only happen if that stuff can integrate into the workflows that people have today. So that, we're investing in Revit integration so that you can just use Hypar for a small part of your process. But ultimately, hopefully, it will encompass more and more of the kinds of processes and maybe even whole phases of design work as we build out that functionality.
Yeah, it's such a complicated, like you said, nested problem where you've got, because I'm thinking like when you say, okay, design team, we're going to design this building over the next year and a half, and all of these components, that all these different blocks, these different functions that make up the whole thing are interdependent, constraint-based. So they're, because that's what design is. It's a series of decisions that you've made to get to the final result. And kind of what we're saying at some level is, well, you can go back to this block way early on and you can still change something, and that will ripple through. And it could, the result could be nuclear, right? Potentially. But it could also be like amazing. It could be magic. I think that's really scary for a lot of people, right? Because what they want to be able to do is say, okay, these series of functions are on lockdown. No one's ever going to touch these again. The decision has been made. Okay, lock those down so that we never have to think about those. And that's why design is broken up into these phases. So it's like, okay, we got sign off. Okay, I'm glad we're never going back there again.
Yeah. But as anyone who's worked in practice knows, like, that thing you locked down gets unlocked.
Yes, it does.
Like, those decisions that you made and you committed to somebody throws a wrench into the works, or you discover, something new about the site that you didn't know, or some new constraint, or, the cost of steel goes way up or whatever. And those changes have to be revisited. And I think that, like, the reality is that it will, as you put it, I like the term nuclear. Like, upstream changes today are always nuclear.
True.
They're just always nuclear. If you have to revisit an earlier decision, it will break everything else. And it's a while before we will reach the promised land, which people have been talking about since early days of Dynamo and Grasshopper,
right,
of like non-nuclear upstream change.
Right.
It's a great idea. It remains challenging because there's still so much manual modeling and tweaking that has to happen. So until there's a world where the manual modeling and tweaking can coexist healthily with the automatic stuff, we will never realize that vision. And I suspect there will always be a degree of nuclear to upstream change. But I firmly believe that we can lessen the scale of those detonations, let's say.
It's funny because it's true, right? Like it does change. Like, you didn't talk to OSHA. And so therefore, insert nuclear level event right there.
Yeah,
right.
Right.
Yeah, and especially doing these larger projects. I think we're kind of, that's what we're kind of talking about here, because those are a different level of nuclear. But it really is like, you didn't talk to that agency, you didn't talk to that official, you didn't talk to this group, this multi-headed, this. There's so many of those floating around out there, those landmines that do come up when you least expect it. And it does have these insane repercussions. And so do you guys have conversations at Hypar around this kind of mixed mode of working, the manual versus the automated, the back and forth? Because you guys right now are very automated, right? You're very much on the automated side of things. You draw one simple sketch and it does a bunch of things based off of that. Like, but you can't go in and tweak one of those edges of a polyline and like, you can't switch it to something else.
Right. Well, I think so. We have these conversations all the time, and I actually think the functionality that we'll be working on over the next couple months will start to round out this story with some of the direct manipulation and editing and stuff. It is a wickedly challenging problem.
I can imagine.
I think one way in which Hypar is an improvement in terms of the sort of the nuclear problem on the sort of automated side of things over existing tools like Grasshopper Dynamo is that, like, the way functions are described in Hypar, they lay out basically a contract for how you work with them. They say, these are the things that I need. This is the information I need from the rest of the model to run. And this is the stuff that I produce. And it creates these sort of like clear boundaries between steps in a process. So I actually can go into a hyper model and strip out the massing strategy and inject a new massing strategy that obeys the same contract. And it will have all the downstream propagation that you could ever want. When you try and do that in Grasshopper and Dynamo, like, unless you're just referencing one new polysurface, which is never the case, it's always like a whole new strategy, ripping out this part of the definition and then stripping in another part of the definition or the script, Grasshopper
Good
surgery,
luck.
I used to
Yeah.
call it,
Yeah.
is like, good luck. It's just not doable because we haven't learned the discipline of in software, it's software architecture. Like, how do you build your scripts in such a way that there are sort of like well-defined boundaries and interfaces between pieces of responsibility? And Hyper is designed with that very idea in mind. It's like, I can define the boundary around a system and I can describe everything that system needs and everything it produces. And then somebody else can make a new version of that same system and it will just work in whatever context mine did. So that's at least one step in the direction of kind of improving this nuclear problem. And I think that a lot of what's to come as far as direct modeling in Hyper, like actually being able to physically drag an edge, drag a vertex, like override a property of an object in the view, all of these things we're going to develop with this core intention of making it as friendly to change as possible, making it as non-nuclear as we can get.
Yeah, that's incredibly exciting. I mean, and I could see the appeal from your point of view of coming from where you've come from to this kind of new paradigm of modeling, but also just like producing architecture, right? I mean, there's a whole other side of things, which is the drawing side of things, right? Which is what architects actually have to deliver for now, hopefully. I mean, again, talking about a long road, but I think this is a really exciting problem to work on. And like you said, wicked, I mean, there's tame problems and there's wicked problems. And this is definitely on the wicked problem side of things. And to me, like that's got to be really exciting and enticing for someone like you.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, I think a lot of my interest, I mean, I've been interested in design tools since day one, but the kinds of problems that we are looking at right now with Hyper are so tremendously exciting and motivating to me. And it really, I think it feels like with the team we have and the team that we're building that we could actually get there. We could actually, it feels like real solutions to some of these wicked problems are actually like within reach. I'm sure, as wicked problems are, like, we'll be faced with all kinds of things we didn't think of and all kinds of scenarios and situations that we didn't account for. But I really feel like we're on the right track, and there's a lot of really exciting stuff coming right around the corner that I think will demonstrate our approach to this stuff.
All right, so everybody's got to watch the Twitter and the Discord so they can find out what those things are, because that's where you guys announce this. We'll put a link to those in the show notes because I think it is fun watching you guys develop this stuff, and just to watch kind of this pace that you guys are at is amazing. It's really fun to watch. So I think we should start to wrap up, but first I like to tie these episodes together and ask, what's something that if you could share that you use or you do to help yourself perform better? I mean, you are a machine, Andrew, right? Like I heard Ian talking about you one day and he's like, I don't know how he does it, but he's on Twitter and he's doing all this coding and he's releasing, like how does he, I don't know how he does it, but I'm glad he does, right? So share something that you can with our audience here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know that I have a great answer to this. I feel like my relationship to like work and productivity has actually changed a lot just in COVID.
Yeah.
Like, I think actually at the beginning of quarantine, I was using work as a coping mechanism. Mm-hmm. It was like a way to distract myself from everything else that was going on, all these huge, intractable, terrifying problems, by focusing on small, tractable problems that I could just throw myself into. And so at the very beginning of COVID, I was getting up at like 5:45 and just sitting down at my desk and starting working until 9. Yeah. I've backed away from that a little bit because I don't, even though I was having fun,
You can't do that forever.
I don't
Yeah.
think that's like, you can't do it forever, and nor should you.
Right.
Um, and so, I think that like the thing that keeps going and that motivates me in terms of productivity, I think is like, it's trite, but I just really love what I'm doing. Like I have never had more fun in my life than working on this product and feeling really passionately engaged in the kinds of problems we're trying to solve. I mean, the team really helps with that too. I love everybody else on the team. They're super amazing. They bring incredible perspective, wisdom, knowledge to the table, and it's just a joy to interact and build with them. As far as like things that keep me sane outside of work time, I do think that, and unfortunately, the downside of this is that it still has me seated at my desk at my computer. But that's doing like generative drawing and actually using some of the same tools, honestly, things like Grasshopper and one of these days I'll be making art with Hypar, although we're not quite there. And making drawings, making like generative artwork.
Mm-hmm.
I find that it's really relaxing to me to detach from the considerations of like practical problem solving and just sort of treat creation as itself this sort of like, self-directed process. And I sit down at Grasshopper with no idea in my head of what I'm going to build, but it just sort of emerges in partnership with the tool. I think it goes back to this question earlier about, creative tools. I think that like there's something magical about Grasshopper itself that it can facilitate that kind of, sort of organic exploration and trying stuff and play, like you put it. So I think that's one thing for me, has just been to spend some time creating without the pressure of, oh, is it going to be buggy? Like I give myself the freedom to build things that are really janky or really hacky or really poorly documented and are just fun and are just a flow. It's just like, yeah, I'm just building stuff and I'm just like thinking and making together. I think has been really important to me. Although I will confess I've been doing a little less of it over the last couple of months.
Well, you're very, I don't, this is probably before your time, but you're very Bob Ross in this scenario, right? Because you should totally start a YouTube channel where you are doing happy little algorithms, and I could definitely see you, like, that's what it is. It's an exploration, and there's no burden on the outcome, right? And so it really does allow you that freedom to express yourself, and who cares what it looks like under the hood, because you're never going to use it again. And you're learning through the process. You're getting better at what you do. And like I'm looking at this artwork behind you. It's gorgeous. And I know you've got it on your website and people can get it. So we definitely want to plug that here in a minute. But I think you guys are doing some amazing work, and I'm really rooting for you, and I think that like even this little things that you use to keep yourself sane play a huge part in this other part of your life that's extremely important for our profession. You guys really are taking on a huge, it's just this crazy slog to the North Pole that you're trying to do, and it's I'm really rooting for you guys. It's awesome.
Well, thanks.
Okay, so next question here. So who are you listening to, or who are you reading? Like, who's influencing Andrew right now?
So, I was actually like pretty tied into like, I mean, obviously I'm like a Twitter addict and I spend a ton of time on Twitter. And there was a moment, and I was getting into a lot of like political stuff on Twitter too. And I just like, I've given myself the permission to like detach from the world a little bit. And the thing that I've been reading is actually one of my favorite books of all time. Gödel Bach by Douglas Hofstadter. It's a classic, and I've read it a few times, but I'm going back to it and just savoring the just like immense richness of it. If you're not familiar with the book, it's sort of this weird meditation on all kinds of things, but primarily sort of overlap conceptually in patterns between things like the music of Bach, the art of Escher, the mathematics of Gödel, and it's it touches on so many things. It touches on artificial intelligence and the nature of the mind and recursion, and all of these things. It sounds like 1,000 disparate topics, and in a way it is, but it's also this masterful joining together into a set of relationships of all of these ideas. And so it's been actually like really refreshing for me to kind of retreat into sort of like pure intellectual pleasure of, just like thinking about big ideas and not worrying so much about the world at large and the state of politics and the state of the environment and the state of the economy and all of those other things that weigh on us.
Yeah, no, that's a great recommendation. And I think you talked earlier about getting into a flow state while working, but it's also important to have that balance of that flow state without any outcome like that you're looking for, right? It's just feeding your soul on a level that is necessary for that balance.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, last question here is, where can people follow you online? Where can they learn more about you? Anything that you want to talk about or plug here is wide open.
I'm all over the internet. I'm digitally promiscuous, let's say. So I'm everywhere. You can find me. I'm pretty active on Twitter. I'm not as active on Instagram as I used to be, although I still post every now and then. And that's where you can find all of the like generative art stuff. I have a website, andrewheumann.com. You can go to shop.andrewheumann.com to purchase some of my generative artwork, which I make using Grasshopper and a pen plotter. It's a little like robot, which you probably can't see on the camera over my shoulder, where, I fit it with a pen and it draws the stuff that I dream up. So yeah, there's that. And yeah, otherwise just I'm Andrew Heumann on Twitter and Being Human, spelled like my last name, Heumann, on Instagram.
I love how you actually get the artwork out of the computer into a physical form. That to me is the key to, it's right behind you, and it's got this huge impact, and it just doesn't have that on a screen where it's just so, magazine-like, where you just flip through it and then you never see it again. This is something that is worth putting out into the world. So it's great.
I think it gets back to something we were talking about earlier, but the sort of necessity of constraints in a creative environment. I think that like something becoming physical introduces a level of constraint that just isn't, it's a different kind of constraint than the one that you face on the screen. And I really appreciate like every time the line wobbles a little bit because of, the pen, or the pen bleeds a tiny bit, or the ink runs together. Those to me are the moments of the most magic.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's a beautiful way to put it, because you don't see it coming. And it is one of those happy little accidents that just, it happens through the process, and you learn from it, and you might learn that, oh, you want that to happen even more, right? Like it's not necessarily a bad thing, and it's just an outcome of the process. So it's cool stuff. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. It was a fun conversation.
Sure. It's a pleasure.
Yeah,
it was really nice chatting with you. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks for hanging out with us today. This show is part of the Gable Media Podcast Network. You can see all the shows at gablemedia.com. That's GABLMEDIA.com. You can help support what I'm doing here by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out, and of course, share it with your friends. I'd love to hear from you, so leave a comment on the website at trxl.co/podcast, where you can find every episode. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram and YouTube. Just search for eTroxel. Talk to you soon.